Richard Chen never forgot where he came from. At 52 years old, he sat in his corner office on the 37th floor of Chen Industries, staring at a photograph that most CEOs would never display. It showed a younger version of himself mopping floors in this very building 28 years ago. That janitor had dreamed of something more. Now that dream occupied the executive suite, but Richard worried he had lost touch with the heartbeat of his own company. The people who kept these halls clean, who arrived before dawn and left after dusk, who made everything possible while remaining invisible. He needed to see his company through their eyes. He needed to remember. What he would discover in the next 7 days would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the true measure of a person's character. Richard called his assistant Maria into his office on a Monday morning. Only she and the head of HR would know about his plan. For 1 week, he would become James Riley, a new janitor on the night shift. He would clock in at 10 p.m. and work until 6 a.m., cleaning offices, emptying trash, and watching how his company truly operated when the executives went home. Maria had objected at first, worried about his safety in the deception, but Richard remained firm. This was not about catching people doing wrong. It was about understanding the reality his frontline employees faced every single day. That first night, Richard parked his BMW 3 blocks away and walked to the employee entrance carrying a lunchbox his wife had packed. He wore the gray uniform of the janitorial staff with a name tag that read James. His hands trembled slightly as he swiped the employee badge that HR had created. The locker room smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. A woman in her 60s looked up from tying her shoes and smiled warmly. Her name tag said Dolores. "Welcome to the night crew," she said. "First day is always the hardest. Stay close to me and I will show you the ropes. You seem like a sweet man." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. When was the last time someone had called him sweet? When had anyone looked at him with such unguarded kindness, expecting nothing in return? Dolores spent the next hour teaching him the proper way to mix cleaning solutions, how to efficiently vacuum large spaces, and which offices required special attention. She shared her dinner of homemade tamales with him during their break, telling him about her 3 grandchildren and how this job helped her make ends meet after her husband passed. The work was exhausting. Richard's back ached by 2 a.m. His hands grew raw from chemicals despite the gloves. But something else was happening. He overheard conversations that would never reach the executive floor. Tom, a janitor in his 40s, mentioned skipping his diabetes medication to afford his daughter's college textbooks. Sharon worried aloud about her car breaking down, knowing she could not afford the repairs. Yet these people laughed together. They encouraged each other. They took pride in their work. On the 3rd night, Richard was cleaning the executive floor when he heard voices in the VP of Operations office. Gerald Morrison had been with the company for 12 years, and Richard had trusted him completely. The door was slightly open, and Richard recognized Gerald's voice immediately, along with 2 members of the board of directors. "Richard is losing his edge," Gerald was saying. "The company needs younger leadership. Someone who understands that sentimentality is bad for business. These inefficiency reports I have been compiling show exactly why we need to make major cuts. Starting with the janitorial and maintenance staff. We outsource those positions, we save $4 million annually. I have the votes lined up. When we present this to Richard next month, he will have no choice but to agree or step aside." Richard froze, his hand gripping the mop handle. $4 million in savings meant pink slips for people like Dolores, Tom, and Sharon. People who had families depending on them. People who formed the very foundation of his company. And Gerald was positioning himself to take over, painting Richard as weak for caring about employee welfare. He forced himself to finish cleaning the floor and move on, his mind reeling. The next morning, he drove home in a daze. His wife found him sitting in their kitchen, still in his janitor's uniform, staring at nothing. Over the remaining days of his experiment, Richard paid closer attention. He noticed that Gerald arrived at the office late and left early, yet constantly sent emails at odd hours to create the illusion of dedication. Richard watched as Gerald dismissed ideas from lower-level employees in meetings that Richard attended in his janitor disguise, cleaning the conference room while decisions were made. The man he had trusted was building a case for efficiency that would devastate dozens of families while positioning himself for a promotion. But Richard also witnessed something else. He saw Dolores stay 2 hours past her shift to help train a new employee, refusing overtime pay because she wanted the young single mother to succeed. He watched Marcus, the maintenance supervisor, use his own money to buy supplies when the budget ran short rather than let repairs go undone. He observed how the night crew collaborated, covering for each other during family emergencies, sharing food, and celebrating small victories together. These people embodied the values Richard had built his company on, yet they existed in a world completely separate from the executive decisions being made about their futures. On his final night as James Riley, Richard found Dolores crying in the supply closet. Her daughter had been in a car accident and needed surgery, but Dolores's insurance had a high deductible she could not afford. Richard wanted desperately to reveal himself, to write a check on the spot, but he needed to see this through. Instead, he sat beside her and listened. He held her hand while she worried about losing her home to medical bills. He promised her that good people find a way through dark times, even when he questioned whether that was true. The next morning, Richard Chen returned to his office as CEO. He called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. Gerald Morrison arrived confident, perhaps assuming this was the moment he would present his efficiency plan. The board members who had been in Gerald's office that night looked equally assured. Richard stood at the head of the table and placed a gray janitor's uniform on the surface. He watched understanding and panic flash across Gerald's face. For the past week, Richard began, I have worked as a janitor in this building. I have mopped floors, emptied trash, and listened. I have learned more about this company in 7 nights than I learned in 7 years sitting in this office. I know about the loyalty of people who arrive when we sleep and leave when we wake. I know about employees who sacrifice their own well-being for their families and for this company. And I also know about betrayal. He looked directly at Gerald. I know about plans to gut our workforce in the name of efficiency, to outsource the very people who make this company function, to paint compassion as weakness and greed as strength. The room erupted. Gerald attempted to defend himself, claiming he was only trying to increase shareholder value. Richard let him speak, then quietly asked the board members to consider what kind of company they wanted to lead. One focused solely on quarterly reports, or one that understood that taking care of employees was not just morally right but economically sound because loyalty and pride in work could never be outsourced. Richard announced his decision. Not only would there be no cuts to the janitorial and facilities staff, but he was implementing immediate changes. A company healthcare fund to help employees facing medical emergencies. Fair raises for all hourly workers. Profit-sharing bonuses that included every employee, not just executives. Education assistance for employees and their children. And Gerald Morrison was terminated, effective immediately. 2 weeks later, Richard attended a company town hall. He stood before hundreds of employees and told them everything. He showed them pictures of himself as a young janitor in this building. He shared what he had learned during his week behind the mop. He introduced Dolores to thunderous applause and announced that her daughter's medical bills would be covered by the new emergency healthcare fund. He was the first to contribute. The story spread beyond the company. Media outlets covered the CEO, who went undercover not to catch wrongdoing but to understand his employees. Other companies began examining their own treatment of essential workers. Richard received thousands of letters from people thanking him for proving that compassion and business success were not mutually exclusive. But the moment that mattered most came on a quiet evening when Richard returned to the night shift, this time as himself. He worked alongside Dolores and the crew, cleaning offices side by side. She smiled at him the way she had that first night, with unguarded kindness, and told him he had not changed at all. He was still that sweet man who listened, who cared, who remembered where he came from. In a world that often mistakes cruelty for strength and compassion for weakness, Richard Chen proved something powerful. The true measure of leadership is not found in corner offices or quarterly reports. It lives in how we treat those who can do nothing for us. In remembering that behind every job title is a human being with dreams, struggles, and dignity that deserves recognition. 1 week disguised as a janitor did not just save Richard's company from a soulless transformation. It reminded everyone that the most important work happens in the spaces we overlook, done by people we too often forget to see. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never wasted, and that every person we meet carries an invisible weight we know nothing about. Subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories for more reminders that compassion can change the world, one choice at a time. Because in the end, we are all just people trying to do our best. And that is worth celebrating. Thank you for watching, and remember to look for the helpers, the quiet heroes, and the overlooked souls who make everything possible. They are everywhere. You just have to be willing to see them.